So, Sarah, to start us off, I'd like to touch on what's happening with the movement of materials and equipment across state lines. I'm going to be looking at it specifically from the standpoint of the construction industry and how it's affecting projects across the country. Now, it's interesting because the Associated General Contractors did their weekly study, and their most recent study of conditions for contractors during the COVID-19 pandemic indicated that roughly 49% of respondents were saying that they had been notified by a buyer or a subcontractor that deliveries of material are either going to be delayed or halted. But yet, what I'm also hearing is that even with that, that's not necessarily really impacting the ability to get materials and to move materials across the country, and especially regionally. And we'll be hearing more about some of the challenges that transportation companies in general are having in that regard later in the episode from Kurt Benning. But it seems like the real problem area are the disruptions that are happening in imported materials coming into the U.S. There seems to be more challenges in getting certain types of supplies from overseas markets. And to kind of talk us through a little bit of what is going on in the industry, I interviewed Joe Piero, Vice President, Corporate Director of Supply Chain Management at Gilbane Building Company. And that full interview is available as a podcast on forconstructionpros.com. But here's a little excerpt of what he had to say on this particular subject.
You know, we never really worry too much about tile coming from Italy, or lighting coming from China or Mexico, or glass maybe coming from South America, whatever it might be. Those lead times, for the most part, were fairly consistent. But now this happens, and we have some plants that are shutting down. Some of that demand that might have been going to those plants is now redirected, say, to a domestic plant. Need to know how that domestic plant is going to respond. Will they be taking these orders? Do they have the capacity to handle them? I need visibility to terminals, to ports. Did the CDC come in and shut down a port? Is it temporary? What happens with quarantined containers, with that tile sitting in there or that lighting sitting in there? What happens to the motor freight or the rail freight, which is called drayage, coming out of those ports? You know, it's a bit of a rock fight, unfortunately, fighting for the capacity on those trucks or those trains, because it's not just my industry that's looking for that capacity. It's every industry that's fighting for the capacity.
Sure.
There are drivers even to operate. Can people unload the vessels and so forth? So the change has just been kind of like drinking water through a fire hose. It has been very, very rapid.
Sarah, can you talk now about what you're seeing from the manufacturing perspective? Are you also seeing similar types of things happening in your industry?
Yeah, from what we've been kind of seeing and hearing so far is it's a little bit of a mix. Some people aren't having issues yet. Others are. I kind of recently spoke with the National Fluid Power Association, who said they've heard from a small amount of manufacturers who have noted that they've had some delays and have had some suppliers they've had issues because they're closed or there's just slower delivery times. But then AEM recently released a survey of U.S. equipment manufacturers and found that 7 out of 10 executives from these equipment manufacturers have experienced moderately negative impact from the supply chain, and with a quarter of them saying that it's been extremely negative. So it's just, at the moment, it seems it's kind of a mixed bag of what they're seeing. And I'm guessing as some of them start to reopen their facilities, they might start to have a little bit more of an issue because the supply chains in various industries are sounding like they are strained.
Has there been any indication of where the biggest disruptions are, whether it's on the imported materials or whether it's domestic suppliers?
The only thing I've heard really about that is when I spoke with the Heavy Duty Manufacturers Association, they mentioned that the shutdown due to COVID in Mexico and the cross-border trade issues with that has caused a lot of disruptions for its members. So that's really the only one I've heard of so far. I think some of the Europeans have also had a little bit more of an issue just because, and anything coming from China, it sounds like has been an issue. But those that have US-based suppliers have had a little easier time from what we've heard so far.
And that actually plays into what I was going to mention next, is that interestingly enough, we're actually seeing declines in construction costs this time. I think there's some pretty obvious reasons for that. Ken Simonson, chief economist at the Associated General Contractors of America, again, in their latest survey of members, he indicated that 38% of members are reporting projects underway being halted in the month of March. 31% reported cancellations already for projects underway in April. So there is definitely a decline in construction activity right now. Mike Belleman, president of and CEO of the Associated Builders and Contractors, he's estimating that the industry is down by as much as 20 to 30% overall. Wow. So clearly the demand for materials, it has decreased as a result of that. But the flip side of that is that domestic suppliers able to capitalize on the tariffs that were implemented in the last year or so, whether that be the steel tariffs, other tariffs that have been put in place on materials that impact the construction process. Domestic suppliers started ramping up their production. Distributors of materials began building up inventories as a result, and they were able to capitalize on that. According to Joe Pirro at Gilbane, this actually enabled most local or regional distributors to get ahead of any of the restrictions on movement of materials across states. So as a result, we're not seeing as much of a delay there and as much of a lag in availability there. But one of the caveats with that is these inventories that have been built up won't last forever, and that might starting to be consumed fairly quickly. And we have the potential for some real challenges ahead as job sites starts to ramp up again once restrictions start to be eased, and we start to see construction activity starting to return to more of a, not necessarily a normal pace, but a stronger pace than where it's currently at. Mike Belleman, the Associated Builders and Contractors, I spoke with him as well in a podcast interview, also available on forconstructionpros.com. And he indicated there is the risk that distributors and their suppliers won't be able to keep up with the demand. And I'd like to share some of his comments from that podcast interview here in this clip.
But with regards to supply chain, we're working through the inventories, and we're starting to see that if we don't get all this supply chain back up and running, we think we're going to start having some impact. So when we talk about reopening America and really trying to get back in shape with regards to construction and get it back to where the economy will support whatever it will support, a concern that we have is we're going to need to kickstart manufacturing, we think, a little bit earlier than we may construction, just so that there's a fluid, continuous flow of work. Light fixtures is an example. Glass is an example. So, we're starting to see, maybe some little bit of issues. And of course, then with regards to supply chain, personal protective equipment. Do we have enough masks? Do we have enough wash stations? Do we have enough hygiene facilities that we've really upped the game on to make sure that people can wash their hands and do all the things that we need to do to meet the CDC guidelines?
Sarah, what are you hearing in terms of this particular situation? Are you hearing concerns there with the manufacturers about being able to keep up with demand once the doors start to open again?
We are, yeah. So in AEM's survey that they just released, they said demand for heavy equipment is down due to everything and contractors being shut down and or not working as much or having as much income. Same for farmers, and a lot of the equipment markets were already kind of struggling at the beginning of the year, ag especially. But even on the supplier side, HDMA mentioned that in addition to the border issues with suppliers, those that are here in the US are just kind of using up their supply, but it's uncertain as to what's going to happen once they burn through those inventories. Are they going to be able to have ramped up production again to fulfill? Many companies are looking at alternate sources for getting supplies, but that's also been a little bit difficult, HDMA said, because depending on how the virus has spread in various areas and the differentiation between international and domestic shelter-in-place orders, and just it's so widespread, the differentiation, that it's hard to say how they're going if they're going to be able to get certain supplies. So HDMA said that about 78% of its members who were recently surveyed are developing new supply chain plans, which they'll likely continue once this is all over, because supply, that's always been something that companies have had to kind of look at and focus on. I recently spoke with the president of Stark Manufacturing, Rachel Mize, to get an idea of how they've been continuing to work and manufacture products throughout all of this. And she did mention some aspects about how they're working with their suppliers at the moment. So we'll show a quick clip of that, and then the full video can be found at oemoffhighway.com.
Most of our supply chain is located in North America. We had, in January with China being shut down, Lunar New Year, and then it extended for the coronavirus. We had a few hiccups, not too bad, but then once it started infiltrating Europe and North America, we've had a few issues here and there. We have, if at all possible, we have redundant suppliers for products, but being in our industry, everything is custom engineered. Mm-hmm. We're pretty vertically integrated, so we do a lot of machining in-house. So those things where we may not be able to get a component from a supplier, often we can come up with a contingency plan to keep that supply going. But it's a something that you may update and check once a week. We're checking 2 times a day.
One of the things I'd like to kind of back up to, Mike Belleman did bring with ABC did bring up kind of an important point at the end of that audio clip that we played here, is the availability of personal protective equipment. One of the biggest challenges that we're hearing is actually the ability to access PPE and meet the CDC guidelines on construction sites. And this is, according to Joe Pirro at Gilbane, this is one of the biggest indirect material challenges that is taking place right now. It's the ability to masks, sanitizing wipes, hand sanitizers, etc., to ensure that workers are safe on job sites. We're hearing it's actually, in some cases, delaying or halting projects due to supply shortages because they aren't able to meet CDC guidelines for safety equipment. Are you hearing anything along those lines also in the manufacturing sector? Because I have to believe that this is only going to be a problem that becomes compounded later on, because one of the things that Joe Pirro mentioned is that globally there are very limited supplies of things such as N95 masks. And the fact that there is not a lot of opportunity to switch suppliers to be able to leverage that availability of different supplies, it's really kind of hamstrung a lot of different market sectors.
Yeah, it's a concern for manufacturers as well, is what we've heard. They need to keep their employees safe, and many of them are still in operation. It might be reduced hours and shifts, but they still are, many of them supply to essential industries like trucking and agriculture. So they need to keep working to an extent and keep their employees safe. So that is a concern. And HDMA mentioned that many of their member companies noted that in their recent survey. And I know many manufacturers have made donations to the healthcare industry because the PPE supplies are extremely necessary for those people, but some of them have also mentioned, they're only donating from their own inventory of PPE what they feel they can, because they need to keep their employees safe as well. So I think it'll be an ongoing issue.
Yeah, and it is interesting because we have heard of a number of different manufacturers who have shifted their production over to producing things like face masks and other safety apparel, other products that can help both the medical field, but also to help their own industry and industries like the construction industry as well.
Yeah. There's been a lot of manufacturers that we've heard about, everybody from Cummins to JCB, and just it's almost every day there's somebody. So that will hopefully help. But I know the need is just so great and some of them can only do so much. So.
Right, and that's something that we will touch upon, I think, in future episode. The importance of what needs to take place in order for industries to be able to move forward as we start to see the COVID-19 pandemic hopefully stem in the near future. But there will be some changes that will need to take.
I know we had some recent news from a market analysis company about some thoughts on how manufacturers could implement certain safety procedures going forward, and gave some insights. And Purdue University has a working paper for manufacturers on it at the moment, and some best practices or thoughts on how to keep employees safe and continue to produce product as we start to slowly come through all of this.
And of course, we'll continue to report on this and provide as much guidance as we can and resources to both construction industry as well as to the manufacturing industry on forconstructionpros.com and OEMoffhighway.com.